Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. If you had been born in a small island colony, far from the centres of power, with no clear claim to family name or inheritance, what path would truly have been open to you? In the pages of history we think we know, there are often questions we have never paused to ask. Tonight, we begin with one of them. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, share where you're listening from and what the local time is there. It's always quietly remarkable to see how many different corners of the world gather for these evenings. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the middle decades of the 18th century, the Atlantic Ocean was not a barrier but a highway. Ships moved in steady circuits between West Africa, the Caribbean, and Europe. Sugar, rum, molasses, and human beings were counted in ledgers as assets. The islands of the British West Indies were small in geography, but immense in economic importance. Their plantations supplied wealth to merchants in London and Bristol. Their harbours received vessels creaking under heavy cargo, and anxious captains watching the weather. It was in this world of trade and hierarchy that a child named Alexander Hamilton first opened his eyes. His exact year of birth was uncertain, and that uncertainty would follow him quietly through life. The island was Nevis, and later St. Croix, then under Danish control but connected by commerce to British markets. The society was sharply divided. At the top stood plantation owners, many absentee. Beneath them were overseers, clerks, and tradesmen. At the base, enslaved Africans laboured in fields that shimmered under relentless sun. Daily life on such an island was structured by heat and accounting. Mornings began early. Work in warehouses and counting houses required discipline. Hurricanes were feared with reason. Illness spread quickly in humid air. The church offered moral structure, though practice varied widely. Education was limited and often reserved for the legitimate sons of established families. Hamilton's own family circumstances were complicated. His mother, Rachel, had left a previous marriage that had become untenable. Her separation created legal and social consequences. In a society that valued clear lines of inheritance, legitimacy was more than a moral label. It was a financial condition. Alexander and his older brother James were considered illegitimate. That fact shaped not only how others saw them, but what opportunities were formally closed. Yet St. Croix was not entirely rigid. Commerce demanded literacy and numeracy. Ships required manifests. Sugar barrels required counting. In this practical world, skill could sometimes soften stigma. Hamilton's father, James Hamilton, drifted in and out of commercial ventures. Stability was not a family strength. Financial reversals were common across the islands, but in the Hamilton household they were personal and immediate. When his father left, the household's vulnerability increased. His mother worked in a small shop. Young Alexander absorbed more than his years might suggest. He watched transactions, listened to conversations about credit and debt, and observed how quickly fortunes shifted when a shipment was delayed or a storm intervened. Economic fragility was not an abstraction, it was daily reality. The Caribbean of his childhood was also a world of stark contrasts. Wealth and suffering stood in proximity. Enslaved labourers worked under supervision in cane fields that seemed endless to a child's eye. Markets in town displayed imported fabrics, tools, and spices. Sailors from different nations exchanged news and rumour. News travelled more slowly than ships, but it travelled nonetheless. European wars affected sugar prices. Parliamentary debates in London shaped colonial taxation. Even distant political decisions rippled through island commerce. Hamilton received some formal schooling, though not continuous. Books were valuable and scarce. Education required patronage. He read what he could find. The Bible was widely available and offered both moral instruction and language training. Merchants' manuals and arithmetic texts provided practical instruction. In a place where advancement depended on precision in accounts, mathematics was not optional. He soon began working as a clerk for a trading firm, Beekman and Kruger. The position was not glamorous, but it was instructive. He copied letters, recorded inventories, calculated exchange rates between currencies, and tracked shipments across the Atlantic. He learned how credit extended beyond immediate cash, and how reputation determined who received favorable terms. In a colonial economy dependent on distant markets, information was power. The social climate of the islands fostered both aspiration and resentment. Free men of modest means could rise slightly, but rarely into the ranks of major planters. The legal codes governing slavery were harsh. Religious life varied between Anglican forms and other Protestant expressions. The Enlightenment, stirring in Europe, had not yet transformed Caribbean society, though its ideas would eventually travel with ships and pamphlets. As a boy, Hamilton lived in proximity to hardship. Disease was common, his mother's health declined. When she died, he and his brother were left effectively orphaned. Property laws denied them inheritance because of their status. The small assets remaining were auctioned to cover debts. For a teenager, the lesson was unmistakable. Security required more than effort. It required legal recognition and structured systems. In the counting house, however, he proved capable. During one period when the firm's owners were absent, he managed operations with a seriousness that impressed local observers. He wrote letters in polished prose, negotiating shipments and explaining delays. His style was confident but careful. He understood that clarity in writing could compensate for youth in age. The Atlantic world in those years was tense, but not yet in open rebellion. Britain had emerged from the 7 Years' War with expanded territory but heavy debt. To manage imperial finances, Parliament considered new measures. In North America, colonists debated representation and authority. On the islands, these arguments were observed from a distance. The Caribbean's economic structure depended heavily on imperial protection. Naval power secured trade routes. Planters valued stability. Then came the hurricane of 1772. Storms were familiar in the region, but this one was especially destructive. Roofs were torn away, warehouses collapsed, ships were driven ashore. The air after such storms held a particular stillness, broken by the sound of repair and accounting. Hamilton wrote a detailed account of the devastation. His description, circulated locally, drew attention for its vivid clarity and organized thought. It was less a lament than an inventory of force and consequence. The letter revealed a mind capable of observation beyond its years. Community leaders recognized potential. They discussed raising funds to send him to North America for education. In the Caribbean, options for advanced study were limited. Ambitious young men often sought opportunities in the mainland colonies or Britain. For someone of uncertain birth and limited inheritance, sponsorship was essential. His departure from St. Croix was not a romantic escape, but a calculated investment by others who believed his talents might return honor to their patronage. Ships leaving the island carried sugar and rum. This one carried a young clerk with notebooks and expectations. The sea voyage itself was part of the education. Atlantic crossings exposed travelers to varying conditions of weather and hierarchy. Officers dined separately from common sailors. Food was rationed carefully. Illness could spread quickly in confined quarters. When he arrived in New York in 1773, he entered a society different in climate and structure but similarly stratified. The mainland colonies were agricultural and commercial. Slavery existed there as well, though its forms varied by region. Cities like New York were busy ports with taverns, churches, and meeting halls. Political discussion was more visible than in the Caribbean. Pamphlets circulated. Public meetings debated taxation and rights. For Hamilton, the mainland represented possibility but also adjustment. He was older than many entering preparatory schools, yet less formally educated. He enrolled in classes designed to prepare students for King's College. The curriculum included classical languages, rhetoric, mathematics, and moral philosophy. Enlightenment ideas were discussed more openly. Questions about sovereignty and natural rights were debated in print and in classrooms. The political climate was increasingly strained. The Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party had sharpened colonial grievances. British troops in Boston symbolized imperial authority. Newspapers reprinted arguments from London and colonial assemblies. Merchants worried about boycotts and disrupted trade. Ordinary citizens felt economic pressures in rising prices and uncertain markets. Hamilton absorbed these debates. He read widely. He wrote essays defending colonial resistance. His perspective was shaped by his upbringing in a trade-dependent society. He understood the importance of order and credit. He also understood vulnerability. To him, political instability was not theoretical. It threatened livelihoods. At this stage in his life, his ambitions were forming but not yet fixed. He sought advancement through intellect rather than inheritance. He had seen how legal status could deny property. He had experienced how markets could collapse. In New York, he encountered peers from established families. He lacked their lineage, but not their energy. Daily life in the city involved crowded streets, wooden buildings, and the constant movement of goods. Markets sold bread, meat, and imported items. Churches marked social standing. Taverns served as centers of political discussion. Clothing signaled rank. Apprentices ran errands for masters. Enslaved laborers worked in households and docks. The smell of the harbor mixed with that of livestock and smoke from hearths. Hamilton navigated this environment with determination. He was not physically imposing, but he possessed a quick manner and disciplined habits. He wrote late into the evening. He studied by candlelight. The prospect of conflict between Britain and the colonies was becoming more real. Militia companies drilled. Conversations in public spaces grew sharper. In these early years, he began to consider what form of government could balance liberty and stability. His island childhood had shown him disorder. His education introduced him to political theory. The tension between independence and authority was not abstract. It would soon define his generation. And so, as the young student walked through the streets of New York, past warehouses that resembled those of St. Croix but in cooler air, he carried with him the memory of hurricane winds and the knowledge that systems could fail without warning. The world into which he had been born was shifting. Empires were strained. Colonies were restless. For a boy once denied inheritance, the coming upheaval offered both danger and opportunity. What choices, then, were truly his? The island had shaped his caution. The mainland was shaping his conviction. The Atlantic world was moving toward confrontation, and he, still not yet fully grown, stood at its edge. By the time Alexander Hamilton settled into his studies in New York, the memory of the Caribbean hurricane no longer felt like a single violent episode, but like a pattern he had come to recognize. Events did not wait for preparation. Storms arrived, debts accumulated, parents disappeared, and communities rearranged themselves without ceremony. He carried that awareness into the mainland colonies, where a different kind of storm was forming. The year after his arrival was marked by accelerating political friction. Parliament's earlier attempts to tax and regulate the colonies had already stirred resistance, but enforcement measures hardened positions. In New York, merchants debated whether non-importation agreements would protect their rights or ruin their businesses. Shopkeepers felt the strain when British goods were boycotted. Dock workers experienced irregular employment as trade fluctuated. Ordinary families calculated carefully how to stretch limited resources when imported items grew scarce or expensive. Hamilton attended classes at King's College while the city around him grew louder with argument. The curriculum emphasized logic, classical authors, and moral philosophy. Students studied Cicero and Locke, debated the nature of sovereignty, and practiced structured reasoning. For Hamilton, these were not simply academic exercises. He had seen what happened when legal systems denied protection. He had witnessed how economic instability could leave individuals exposed. Theoretical discussions about government carried immediate relevance. He began writing publicly. Under pseudonyms, he contributed essays defending colonial resistance against what he viewed as parliamentary overreach. His prose was direct and organized. He did not rely on elaborate flourishes. Instead, he laid out arguments with a merchant's clarity. If authority was unchecked, credit and property would suffer. If liberty was undefined, disorder would follow. His background in commerce shaped his political reasoning. The streets of New York reflected growing division. Loyalists and patriots shared neighborhoods but not perspectives. Anglican congregations often leaned toward loyalty to the crown. Other denominations were more varied in sentiment. Taverns became places where pamphlets were read aloud and news from Boston or Philadelphia was discussed. Young men joined militia units for drilling on common grounds. Uniforms were not standardized. Clothing ranged from practical farm garments to more refined attire modified for drill. Hamilton, still in his teens, joined a volunteer militia company. Training sessions required discipline, learning formations, handling muskets, maintaining composure under simulated pressure. For someone accustomed to clerical precision, military order held appeal. It suggested structure in a time of argument. Yet the prospect of actual combat remained uncertain. Many hoped tensions might ease through negotiation. News traveled through newspapers and letters. When fighting broke out at Lexington and Concord in 1775, it marked a turning point. The conflict was no longer hypothetical. British troops and colonial militia had exchanged fire. Casualties were real. The atmosphere in New York shifted from debate to preparation. Committees of correspondence coordinated responses. Supplies were gathered. Questions about loyalty became more pressing. Hamilton's writing intensified. He argued that colonial grievances were not impulsive reactions but reasoned objections to policies imposed without representation. His essays circulated among readers who valued articulate defense of resistance. At the same time, he remained aware that rebellion carried risk. The British Empire possessed experienced forces and naval strength. Success was far from guaranteed. The social fabric of the city tightened. Families discussed allegiances at dinner tables. Business partnerships strained when partners disagreed politically. Enslaved individuals watched these developments with a different set of calculations, aware that upheaval sometimes created openings for freedom, but also new forms of uncertainty. Economic life continued, but with caution. Ships were inspected. Rumors of troop movements influenced prices. Hamilton's own ambition began to clarify. Education alone was no longer sufficient. The unfolding crisis suggested that ability would be tested in action. He studied military manuals alongside classical texts. He observed leaders in the city who organized committees and coordinated defenses. The idea of contributing directly to the cause gained weight. By 1776, the situation in New York had become urgent. British forces prepared to seize the city, recognizing its strategic harbor. Continental forces gathered under the command of George Washington. The scale of mobilization transformed daily routines. Streets filled with soldiers, private homes were requisitioned for quarters. Supplies were scarce. Civilians navigated a landscape where authority shifted between committees and commanders. Hamilton secured a commission as an artillery officer. Artillery required technical competence, calculating trajectories, positioning cannons, coordinating crews. It was a role suited to someone comfortable with mathematics and detail. The noise and smoke of actual battle differed from drills. During engagements around New York, including the Battle of Long Island, he experienced the strain of coordinated fire and retreat. The Continental Army faced setbacks. British forces were disciplined and well supplied. Retreats tested morale. Soldiers marched long distances with limited provisions. Rain and mud complicated movement. Disease spread in camps. Officers struggled to maintain order among troops drawn from different colonies with varying training levels. Washington's leadership emphasized perseverance and strategic withdrawal rather than reckless confrontation. For Hamilton, serving in this environment provided a view of leadership under pressure. He observed the challenges of sustaining an army without stable funding. Congress lacked strong authority to tax. Supplies depended on requisitions and loans. Inflation began to erode the value of paper currency. Soldiers were sometimes paid irregularly. These practical problems reinforced Hamilton's emerging conviction: that political independence would require more than declarations. It would require structured financial systems. During the difficult winter campaigns, he distinguished himself through efficiency and composure. Reports of his performance reached higher command. His ability to write clearly and organize information proved as valuable as his skill with artillery. Washington needed aides capable of managing correspondence, drafting orders, and synthesizing reports from various fronts. In 1777, Hamilton was invited to join Washington's staff as an aide-de-camp. The position moved him from battlefield command to headquarters administration. It involved long hours drafting letters to Congress, state officials, and foreign representatives. He became familiar with the fragile machinery of revolutionary governance. Decisions required coordination across distant states with distinct interests. Headquarters life differed from camp life. While soldiers endured exposure, aides worked by candlelight over stacks of papers. Yet the pressure was intense. Military setbacks had political consequences. Supplies needed negotiation. Alliances required careful language. Washington relied on trusted aides to convey instructions accurately and discreetly. Hamilton's proximity to Washington shaped his development. He observed a leader balancing firmness with caution. Washington was not impulsive. He weighed options and considered long-term consequences. Hamilton, younger and more inclined toward decisive structure, absorbed these lessons while forming his own judgments. The broader society continued to experience strain. Farmers faced requisitions for grain and livestock. Women managed households in the absence of enlisted husbands. Religious leaders offered interpretations of events, some framing the conflict as a moral struggle, others urging restraint. Newspapers printed both encouragement and criticism of military leadership. In this atmosphere, Hamilton matured quickly. The insecurity of his childhood had already fostered self-reliance. War added urgency. He wrote letters that blended strategic analysis with appeals for stronger central authority. He began articulating the idea that fragmented state power weakened the collective effort. The Articles of Confederation under discussion proposed a loose union. Hamilton doubted whether such looseness could sustain credit or defense. Despite his administrative responsibilities, he felt occasional frustration. Battlefield command offered visible distinction. Staff work, though essential, was less publicly recognized. He wrestled privately with questions of honor and ambition. Advancement in a revolutionary army depended on both merit and perception. As someone without established family name in the colonies, he understood that reputation required careful cultivation. Meanwhile, international dimensions complicated the war. France watched developments with interest. European powers weighed the strategic advantage of supporting colonial rebellion against Britain. Diplomacy became intertwined with military campaigns. Hamilton drafted communications that required sensitivity to foreign expectations and domestic realities. The winter at Valley Forge illustrated the limits of American resources. Soldiers endured shortages of clothing and food. Disease reduced numbers, yet training under officers like Baron von Steuben improved discipline. Hamilton observed how organization could transform hardship into resilience. Administrative efficiency, he saw, was not abstract. It determined whether men survived. Through these years, his identity shifted from Caribbean outsider to American revolutionary. He built networks among officers and politicians. He corresponded with influential figures. His marriage prospects began to intersect with his political position, though that development lay ahead. For now, his focus remained on sustaining the war effort. By the late 1770s, the conflict had expanded geographically. Southern campaigns brought new challenges. The Continental Army faced cycles of advance and retreat. Public patience wavered as costs mounted. Inflation accelerated. Merchants hesitated to extend credit. Hamilton's earlier experience in commerce made him particularly sensitive to the erosion of financial trust. He advocated measures to strengthen central fiscal authority. In letters to members of Congress, he argued that without reliable revenue, independence would be hollow. His reasoning drew not only from theory, but from lived experience of markets collapsing when confidence faltered. Hamilton stands not yet as the architect of a nation's finances, but as a young officer who has seen how fragile institutions can be. The boy shaped by island storms now navigates the storm of revolution. His ambitions are sharpened by exposure to leadership and by the visible weaknesses of the existing political framework. The world around him remains uncertain. The war is not won, the Union is not secure, and within him, the determination to build something more durable continues to grow. By the late 1770s, New York and the surrounding colonies had ceased to resemble the uneasy but functioning societies Hamilton had first encountered as a student. War had altered the rhythm of daily life. Cities were no longer simply centers of trade and conversation. They were strategic objectives. When British forces secured control of New York City in 1776, it became a stronghold of imperial power. Loyalist families felt safer within its boundaries, while those aligned with the revolutionary cause either fled or adapted carefully to new oversight. Hamilton, attached to Washington's headquarters, moved frequently with the Continental Army as campaigns shifted north and south. The army was less a permanent structure than a determined assembly, held together by shared commitment and constant negotiation. Soldiers from Massachusetts, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and other colonies brought different habits and accents. Some were farmers accustomed to seasonal labor. Others were artisans familiar with guild traditions. Their clothing varied widely: homespun coats, worn boots, patched breeches. Uniformity was an aspiration more than a reality. Headquarters life required translation between these worlds. Reports arrived from field officers describing shortages of powder, disputes among local militias, and appeals for reinforcements. Hamilton drafted responses that balanced encouragement with realism. He learned that morale could not be sustained by enthusiasm alone. It required food, pay, and belief that sacrifices would matter. The broader political climate was evolving as well. In 1777, the Articles of Confederation were adopted by Congress, though full ratification by the states would take time. The Articles created a confederation in which sovereignty largely remained with individual states. Congress could request funds, but lacked power to compel taxation. For many, this arrangement protected liberty by limiting centralized authority. For Hamilton, the structure appeared fragile. His perspective was informed by daily observation. When Congress promised supplies the army did not receive, credibility weakened. When states hesitated to contribute troops or funds proportionally, resentment grew among those who bore heavier burdens. Hamilton's correspondence increasingly reflected concern that without firmer national structure, independence might dissolve into rivalry. Yet the war itself continued to demand immediate attention. In 1777, American forces achieved a significant victory at Saratoga. The surrender of British General Burgoyne's army shifted international calculations. France, long Britain's rival, saw opportunity. In 1778, France formally entered the war on the American side. This alliance changed the strategic landscape. French naval support challenged British dominance at sea. French funds and troops provided critical reinforcement. Hamilton, positioned at the intersection of military and political communication, recognized the importance of the alliance. Drafting letters that conveyed gratitude without dependence required careful tone. The American cause sought support but not subordination. Diplomatic language carried weight equal to battlefield maneuvers. At the same time, the army faced internal tensions. Officers sometimes resented civilian oversight. Soldiers grew impatient with irregular pay. The concept of Republican virtue sacrifice for the common good was frequently invoked, but living conditions tested that ideal. Winter encampments demanded endurance. Disease remained a persistent threat. Smallpox inoculation campaigns required organization and trust. Hamilton's own habits reflected discipline. He rose early, worked through extensive correspondence, and reviewed reports meticulously. He valued precision. Errors in communication could lead to misdirected troops or delayed supplies. His Caribbean experience in commercial accounting translated into military administration. Clarity and speed were essential. Despite his commitment to staff duties, he did not abandon ambition for field command. the desire for distinction remained. In the culture of the 18th century, honor was tied to visible courage and leadership under fire. Serving behind a desk, however crucial, did not fully satisfy that aspiration. He occasionally expressed frustration at being confined to writing when others gained recognition in combat. The social world around headquarters was complex. Officers formed bonds shaped by shared hardship. Some came from established colonial families, others from modest backgrounds. Dinner tables in camp, when provisions allowed, included discussions of philosophy, strategy, and personal advancement. Religious observance varied. Chaplains delivered sermons reminding soldiers of moral purpose. Enlightenment ideas circulated alongside traditional Protestant beliefs. Civilians living near encampments experienced mixed consequences. Armies required supplies and space. Farmers might sell produce at advantageous prices, but they also risked requisition without compensation. Women managed farms in the absence of enlisted husbands. Markets adjusted to fluctuating currency values. Paper money issued by Congress depreciated, complicating transactions. Hamilton observed how economic instability affected morale as directly as battlefield losses. In 1780, a crisis of trust emerged in the form of Benedict Arnold's attempted betrayal. Arnold, once a celebrated American officer, conspired to surrender the fort at West Point to the British. The discovery of the plot shook confidence within the army. Hamilton participated in the correspondence surrounding the exposure of the scheme. The incident underscored vulnerabilities not only in fortifications, but in human loyalty. Trust, Hamilton concluded, could not rest solely on personal virtue. Systems of accountability were necessary. His reflections increasingly centered on institutional design. How could a republic ensure stability without sliding into tyranny? How could it reward merit without entrenching privilege? These questions were no longer theoretical exercises from college debates. They were urgent concerns shaped by wartime experience. Meanwhile, his personal life began to intersect with political networks. Through his association with Washington, he met members of prominent families supportive of the revolutionary cause. Among them were the Schuylers of New York. Philip Schuyler was a general and a figure of influence. His household reflected both wealth and patriotic commitment. The Schuyler daughters were educated and engaged in the social responsibilities expected of their station. Hamilton's courtship of Elizabeth Schuyler developed gradually. In the midst of war, marriages often blended affection with practical alliance. For Hamilton, whose birth had denied him secure status, connection to an established family carried social and political significance. Yet the relationship was not purely strategic. Surviving letters suggest genuine attachment and intellectual companionship. Their marriage in 1780 linked him to networks that would later support his political career. Domestic life during wartime required adaptation. Homes could be requisitioned. Travel was uncertain. Elizabeth's responsibilities included managing household affairs during Hamilton's absences. The union grounded him amid professional turbulence. That same year, the war's focus shifted southward. British strategy targeted southern colonies, where loyalist support was believed stronger. Campaigns in the Carolinas and Virginia intensified. Washington sought to coordinate with French forces for decisive action. Hamilton continued to advocate for more assertive national authority, writing memoranda emphasizing the need for reliable revenue streams. In 1781, an opportunity arose that would satisfy his longing for field command. After a period of tension with Washington stemming partly from personal misunderstanding, Hamilton resigned briefly from his aide position, seeking independent command. The separation was not a break in loyalty but a redefinition of role. He was eventually granted command of a light infantry battalion. During the siege of Yorktown in October 1781, Hamilton led an assault on a British redoubt. The operation required coordination, speed, and restraint. His men advanced at night, capturing the position with relatively limited casualties. The success contributed to the broader siege that culminated in the surrender of British General Cornwallis. Yorktown effectively ended major combat operations in the war. For Hamilton, the assault provided tangible demonstration of leadership under fire. It answered, at least partially, his earlier restlessness. The young clerk from St. Tebay. Croy had become an officer whose actions influenced a decisive campaign. Yet victory did not erase structural concerns. Even as British forces capitulated, the Confederation government remained financially weak. After Yorktown, negotiations toward peace began. Soldiers anticipated discharge. Officers contemplated civilian careers. The army, which had been a unifying institution, faced dissolution. Hamilton resigned his commission in 1782. He returned to New York to pursue legal studies, entering a profession that would engage both his analytical skills and his interest in public affairs. The transition from war to peace presented new challenges. Veterans sought compensation. Debts accumulated during the conflict required resolution. States debated territorial claims and trade policies. Without strong central authority, coordination proved difficult. Hamilton's wartime observations reinforced his belief that independence required more than celebration. It required durable institutions. With the surrender at Yorktown and the gradual winding down of military operations, the atmosphere of urgency that had defined the previous years gave way to something more complicated. Victory did not produce immediate clarity. Soldiers returned to farms and workshops. Officers contemplated reputations earned in war and how they might translate into influence in peace. The Continental Army, once the central instrument of resistance, became a financial and political problem. It required payment, pensions, and recognition from a government that possessed limited means. Hamilton, now in his mid-20s, re-entered civilian life with discipline sharpened by conflict. He began studying law in earnest, reading Blackstone's commentaries and other foundational texts. Legal study at the time did not require formal law school. It demanded apprenticeship, reading, and examination. He absorbed statutes and precedents with the same precision he had applied to artillery calculations and correspondence. New York City in the early 1780s bore visible marks of occupation and transition. British troops had only recently evacuated. Buildings damaged during the war needed repair. Loyalist property claims required adjudication. Trade routes had to be re-established. Merchants assessed opportunities in renewed commerce while confronting debts accumulated during years of disruption. Currency instability complicated transactions. Inflation had eroded savings. Paper money issued during the war had lost much of its value. Hamilton's legal practice quickly expanded. His clients included merchants, creditors, and individuals entangled in disputes over confiscated property. Many cases reflected the unsettled legacy of war. Some loyalists sought restitution for seized assets. Patriots insisted that sacrifices justified such confiscations. The courts became arenas where broader political questions surfaced in technical arguments. His courtroom style emphasized clarity and forceful reasoning. He organized facts systematically and framed arguments in terms of principle rather than emotion. Observers noted his ability to connect individual cases to larger implications for commercial stability. For Hamilton, law was not merely a profession, it was a mechanism for structuring society. The political framework of the new nation remained unsettled. The Articles of Confederation governed relations among states, but Congress lacked authority to impose taxes or regulate interstate commerce effectively. States sometimes enacted tariffs against one another, protecting local interests at the expense of collective efficiency. Disputes over Western lands intensified. Foreign powers, including Britain and Spain, tested American resolve along frontier regions. Economic pressures became increasingly visible. Farmers burdened by debt faced foreclosure. Creditors demanded repayment in hard currency that was scarce. In Massachusetts, these tensions culminated in Shays's Rebellion in 1786, when armed groups protested tax policies and court actions. Though Hamilton was in New York, reports of unrest resonated deeply. To him, such uprisings signaled not merely local grievance but structural weakness in national governance. Within intellectual circles, debates intensified over the appropriate balance between liberty and authority. Many Americans remained wary of centralized power, recalling perceived abuses under British rule. Others, including Hamilton, argued that dispersed authority invited instability. His wartime experience had convinced him that voluntary cooperation among states was insufficient in moments of crisis. In 1786, he attended the Annapolis Convention, a modest gathering intended to address commercial coordination among states. Attendance was sparse, but the discussions revealed broad concern about economic fragmentation. Hamilton drafted a report calling for a general convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. The recommendation led to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia the following year. The Philadelphia Convention of 1,787 assembled delegates from most states. They met in a closed session to encourage candid discussion. Hamilton arrived with ambitious ideas. He favored a strong central government with significant executive authority, though he understood that his proposals would encounter resistance. Many delegates sought compromise between strengthening national power and preserving state sovereignty. The convention's debates were complex. Representation in Congress divided large and small states. The structure of the executive branch required careful design. The role of the judiciary demanded definition. Slavery, embedded in the economic systems of several states, posed moral and political challenges that delegates addressed through uneasy compromises. Hamilton spoke infrequently compared to some delegates, but his interventions were pointed. He advocated for energetic government capable of managing commerce, defense, and foreign policy. His proposals sometimes exceeded what others considered politically feasible. Yet even when his preferred structures were not adopted, he contributed to shaping discussions about federal authority. The final constitution reflected compromise. It established a bicameral legislature, an executive president, and a federal judiciary. It granted Congress authority to tax, regulate commerce, and provide for national defense. Ratification, however, required approval by state conventions. Opposition emerged quickly. Critics feared that the new framework concentrated power dangerously. Hamilton recognized that public opinion would determine the Constitution's fate. In collaboration with James Madison and John Jay, he began writing essays defending the proposed document. Published under the pseudonym Publius, these essays would later be known collectively as the Federalist Papers. Hamilton authored the majority of them. Writing at remarkable speed, he addressed concerns about executive power, the necessity of federal taxation, the role of the judiciary, and the dangers of faction. His arguments drew upon both political theory and practical experience. He contended that a strong union would protect liberty by preventing interstate rivalry and ensuring stable governance. The essays were printed in New York newspapers and circulated widely. They did not eliminate opposition, but they provided structured defense of the Constitution. In New York, ratification was uncertain. Anti-federalists argued that the proposed government lacked sufficient safeguards for individual rights. Hamilton engaged in public debate while also negotiating behind the scenes. Ultimately, New York ratified the Constitution in 1788, though by a narrow margin. The addition of a Bill of Rights, promised to address concerns about individual liberties, helped secure broader acceptance. The new federal government prepared to take shape. George Washington was elected as the first president in 1789. His reputation for integrity and leadership lent credibility to the experiment. Hamilton's role in the new administration would soon prove decisive. Washington appointed him as the first Secretary of the Treasury. The position required addressing the young nation's financial disorder. War debts remained unpaid. State obligations varied widely. Credit abroad was uncertain. Without reliable revenue and established public credit, independence risked erosion. As Secretary, Hamilton moved quickly. He proposed federal assumption of state debts, arguing that consolidating obligations under national authority would strengthen credit and bind states to the Union. He recommended establishing a national bank to facilitate transactions and stabilize currency. He advocated for tariffs to generate revenue and encourage domestic manufacturing. These proposals sparked intense debate. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, among others, questioned the constitutionality of a national bank and worried about concentration of financial power. Political alliances began to solidify into distinct parties. Federalists supporting Hamilton's vision of robust federal authority, and Democratic Republicans favoring stronger state influence and agrarian priorities. The debates were not abstract. They reflected differing visions of America's future. Would the nation develop as a commercial and industrial power integrated into global markets, or remain primarily agrarian with decentralized governance? Hamilton's Caribbean upbringing in a trade-centered economy inclined him toward the former. He believed prosperity required active management and structured credit systems. Within the Treasury Department, he worked long hours drafting reports to Congress. His Report on Public Credit laid out detailed plans for debt management. He emphasized that honoring obligations would establish credibility with foreign investors and domestic creditors. Reputation, he understood, was a form of capital. The Assumption Plan passed after complex political negotiation, including a compromise locating the national capital on the Potomac River. The Bank of the United States was chartered in 1791. These measures strengthened federal authority but deepened partisan division. Newspapers aligned with emerging parties criticized or praised policies vigorously. Hamilton's personal life continued alongside these public responsibilities. He and Elizabeth expanded their family. Domestic routines included managing household finances, overseeing children's education, and participating in social gatherings where political conversation flowed freely. The expectations of public office required maintaining decorum while navigating criticism. By the early 1790s, the United States faced external pressures as well. The French Revolution altered European politics dramatically. Americans debated how to respond. Some sympathized with revolutionary France. Others feared radicalism and instability. Hamilton supported Washington's policy of neutrality, believing entanglement in European conflicts would endanger fragile domestic stability. The presidency of Washington provided a stabilizing presence, yet underlying disagreements sharpened. Hamilton's influence within the administration was significant, but not unchallenged. His correspondence with Washington demonstrated mutual respect, though not complete agreement on every matter. The nation he helped design was still experimental. Roads were limited. Communication between distant states required days or weeks. Frontier settlements expanded westward, raising questions about Native American relations and federal authority. Economic growth coexisted with persistent inequality and regional tension. Hamilton's career during these years reflected continuity from earlier stages of his life. The orphaned clerk, who had learned the importance of credit, now managed national finances. The aide, who had seen administrative weakness, now constructed systems intended to prevent it. His confidence sometimes appeared forceful, even uncompromising. Yet beneath it lay memory of vulnerability. He understood that institutions could fail if left to chance. He believed deliberate design was necessary. Whether his vision would endure without distortion remained uncertain. The Republic was young. Its citizens were divided. Its leaders were ambitious. Hamilton moved forward, convinced that energy in government would secure liberty rather than threaten it. Others remained skeptical. The tension between these perspectives would shape the next chapter of his life and the country's evolution. The early 1790s unfolded with a steady rhythm of reports, debates, and quiet recalculations of power. The Constitution had been ratified, the federal government established, and yet the meaning of this new arrangement remained unsettled in practice. Hamilton's Treasury Office became one of the most active departments in the administration. Clerks copied figures by hand, examined customs receipts from ports, and tallied the slow accumulation of revenue from tariffs. Paper, ink, and arithmetic underpinned the nation's survival. New York City, then the temporary capital, reflected both promise and strain. Its harbor bustled with ships flying various flags. Merchants tested renewed trade with Britain, France, and the Caribbean. Coffeehouses hosted discussions not only about prices of sugar or tea, but about the implications of federal policies. The presence of the national government lent the city a sense of centrality. Lodging houses filled with representatives from distant states. Carriages rolled over uneven streets, carrying officials between boarding houses and meeting halls. Hamilton's routine was demanding. He drafted extensive reports to Congress detailing fiscal strategy. The Report on Manufactures, submitted in 1791, laid out his argument that encouraging domestic industry would strengthen national independence. He proposed modest protective tariffs and government support for emerging manufacturing sectors. The report was detailed, methodical, and forward-looking. It suggested that economic policy was not simply about balancing accounts, but about shaping the country's long-term character. Opposition to his vision grew more organized. Thomas Jefferson, serving as Secretary of State, and James Madison articulated an alternative philosophy. They emphasized agricultural virtue, wary of concentrated financial power. They argued that the Constitution did not authorize creation of a national bank, and feared that close ties between government and financiers would replicate European systems they distrusted. Newspapers sympathetic to Jefferson criticized Hamilton's measures, accusing him of favoring wealthy creditors over farmers. Political language sharpened. Though the Constitution did not anticipate formal parties, alignments formed naturally. Federalists rallied behind Hamilton's emphasis on energetic government. Democratic Republicans coalesced around Jefferson's advocacy of states' rights and limited federal reach. These divisions were not merely personal rivalries. They reflected regional economic interests and differing interpretations of liberty. Hamilton did not avoid conflict. He responded to criticism through essays and memoranda, defending his policies with structured logic. He argued that honoring debts was essential to establishing public credit, which in turn would lower borrowing costs and facilitate growth. He maintained that a national bank would stabilize currency and enable efficient tax collection. His reasoning relied on experience. He had seen markets falter when confidence failed. Within Washington's cabinet, disagreements were frequent, but usually controlled. The president valued unity and sought to mediate between competing viewpoints. Hamilton's influence remained substantial, yet he understood that his proposals required negotiation. The compromise that located the permanent national capital along the Potomac had already demonstrated the necessity of political trade-offs. Beyond domestic matters, international events intruded. The French Revolution intensified, moving from constitutional reform to radical upheaval. The execution of King Louis XVI shocked many observers. Americans who had celebrated France's support during the Revolutionary War now confronted reports of internal violence and shifting alliances. Jefferson tended to view France's struggle sympathetically. Hamilton regarded the turbulence with caution. In 1793, war erupted between revolutionary France and Britain. The United States faced pressure to choose sides. The 1778 alliance with France technically obligated support, yet the nation was militarily weak and financially vulnerable. Washington issued a proclamation of neutrality. Hamilton defended this position, arguing that the alliance applied to defensive war and that American interests required avoidance of entanglement. The decision angered some who believed moral solidarity with France was paramount. Neutrality was not universally respected. French ambassador Edmond Charles Genet attempted to rally American support for French privateering. The resulting controversy, known as the Genet Affair, tested federal authority. Hamilton supported firm response, emphasizing that foreign agents could not override national policy. The episode reinforced his belief in centralized executive power capable of decisive action. Economic growth during these years was uneven. Ports prospered under renewed trade, but rural debt remained heavy. Western farmers in Pennsylvania protested excise taxes imposed on distilled spirits. For them, whiskey was not merely a beverage but a medium of exchange and a means of transporting surplus grain. The tax felt burdensome and distant, imposed by officials in cities far removed from frontier conditions. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 escalated when protesters resisted federal officers. Hamilton advised Washington that allowing armed defiance would undermine federal authority. The president agreed to call out militia forces from several states. Hamilton accompanied the expedition partway, observing how assertion of federal power would be received. The rebellion dissipated without large-scale violence, but the message was clear. The new government would enforce its laws. For critics, this response confirmed fears of centralized coercion. For Hamilton, it demonstrated necessary resolve. A government that could not collect revenue could not sustain credit or defense. The memory of wartime shortages remained vivid. He saw enforcement not as tyranny but as preservation of order. At home, his family life expanded. He and Elizabeth welcomed additional children. Their household required careful management. Domestic routines included overseeing servants, arranging education for older children, and hosting guests whose conversations often turned to policy. The social expectations of a cabinet officer's wife were significant. Elizabeth navigated these responsibilities with steadiness. Hamilton's personal discipline, however, did not shield him from private misjudgment. In 1791, he began an extramarital relationship with Maria Reynolds. The involvement was imprudent and financially compromising. When her husband later attempted blackmail, Hamilton admitted the affair in private correspondence with political associates to counter accusations of financial misconduct. The episode remained largely confidential at the time but would resurface later with damaging effect. Meanwhile, Washington's second term began in 1793. The president's decision to seek re-election reflected awareness that stability required continuity. Hamilton continued shaping fiscal policy, but fatigue from constant opposition grew evident. Political newspapers attacked him with increasing intensity. Personal criticism blended with policy disagreement. In 1795, the Jay Treaty with Britain sought to resolve lingering disputes from the Revolutionary War, including British occupation of frontier forts and trade issues. Hamilton supported the treaty as pragmatic compromise. Jeffersonian critics denounced it as favoritism toward Britain. Public meetings across the country debated its merits. Effigies were burned in protest. The intensity of reaction illustrated how foreign policy could inflame domestic division. Through these controversies, Hamilton maintained conviction that structured governance would outlast transient passions. Yet he also recognized limits of persuasion. Party identity had taken root. Elections increasingly reflected ideological alignment. Newspapers served as instruments of mobilization rather than neutral reporting. In 1795, Hamilton resigned as Secretary of the Treasury, intending to return fully to legal practice and family life. His influence did not vanish. He continued advising Federalist leaders and corresponding with Washington. But the daily administration of finance passed to others. His departure marked the end of a foundational phase in the Republic's fiscal architecture. The systems he had constructed, public credit, assumption of debts, a national bank, remained in operation. Whether they would adapt to changing circumstances depended on successors and political climate. The country was growing geographically and demographically. Immigration increased. Western settlements expanded beyond the Appalachians. Native American nations faced mounting pressure from encroachment. Hamilton's legal career resumed prominence. He represented clients in commercial disputes and constitutional cases. His courtroom presence was methodical. He cited precedent and principle with equal emphasis. The experience reinforced his belief that law provided continuity amid political fluctuation. By the mid-1790s, Washington signaled his intention to retire. His farewell address warned against factionalism and foreign entanglement. Hamilton assisted in drafting portions of that address, embedding his concern about party divisions within the president's final message. The warning reflected shared recognition that unity was fragile. As Washington stepped down in 1797, John Adams assumed the presidency. Hamilton's relationship with Adams was complex. Though both were Federalists, differences in temperament and strategy surfaced quickly. Hamilton's assertiveness sometimes alienated potential allies. His influence within the party remained significant but not uncontested. The republic he had helped shape entered a new phase, characterized by sharper partisan conflict and evolving international pressures. Hamilton, no longer holding cabinet office, continued to advocate for policies he believed essential. His earlier experiences, childhood instability, wartime administrative weakness, and the effort to construct financial order continued guiding his judgments. He moved through these years with energy that sometimes exceeded prudence. Supporters admired his clarity and decisiveness. Critics viewed him as overly ambitious and insufficiently cautious about centralized authority. The tension between those interpretations would intensify as the decade progressed. When George Washington left office in 1797, the sense of protective steadiness that had surrounded the presidency shifted. John Adams assumed leadership, inheriting both the institutions Washington had overseen and the political divisions that had grown during the previous years. Alexander Hamilton, though no longer Secretary of the Treasury, remained deeply involved in Federalist strategy. His influence was substantial, yet increasingly complicated by personality and rivalry. Adams valued independence of judgment and resented what he perceived as manipulation by party factions. Hamilton, accustomed to shaping policy through energetic advocacy, found the new administration less receptive to his direct guidance. Within Federalist circles, a division emerged between those loyal primarily to Adams and those aligned more closely with Hamilton's policy vision. International tensions intensified. Relations with revolutionary France deteriorated after the Jay Treaty. French officials viewed the treaty as evidence of American favoritism toward Britain. Diplomatic exchanges culminated in the so-called XYZ affair in 1797-1798, when American envoys reported that French intermediaries had demanded bribes as a condition for negotiation. Public reaction in the United States was immediate and indignant. Calls for preparedness grew louder. Adams responded by strengthening the Navy and authorizing defensive measures, though he avoided full-scale war. Hamilton supported firm resistance and advocated for expansion of military capacity. Congress authorized creation of a provisional army in 1798. Washington, though retired, agreed to serve as its commander should war erupt. Hamilton was appointed Inspector General and effectively became second in command. The prospect of renewed military organization revived familiar patterns from the Revolutionary War, but circumstances differed. This was not a struggle for independence, but a defense of sovereignty in a precarious international environment. Hamilton approached the task with characteristic intensity. He focused on recruitment, discipline, and structure, emphasizing efficiency. His experience had taught him that poorly organized forces weakened national credibility. Yet domestic politics complicated military expansion. Democratic Republicans feared that a standing army could become an instrument of partisan suppression. Their suspicions were amplified by passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. These laws extended residency requirements for citizenship, authorized deportation of certain non-citizens, and criminalized false statements against the government. Federalists argued that the measures protected national security during crisis. Critics saw them as assaults on free expression and political dissent. Hamilton supported strong national defense, but he was not the principal architect of the Alien and Sedition Acts. Nevertheless, their association with Federalist governance deepened partisan distrust. Newspapers critical of the administration faced prosecution. Political discourse hardened. The balance between security and liberty, always delicate, now carried immediate consequences. Despite preparations, full war with France did not materialize. Naval engagements occurred in the Caribbean during the Quasi-War, but diplomatic channels eventually reopened. Adams pursued negotiations that led to the Convention of 1800, easing tensions. Hamilton privately questioned aspects of Adams's approach, believing stronger posture would secure better terms. Their disagreement remained largely within party correspondence, but contributed to internal friction. Meanwhile, Hamilton's personal life faced strain. The earlier affair with Maria Reynolds, once contained within limited circles, resurfaced publicly in 1797, when political opponents published documents alleging financial corruption. To defend his integrity regarding public funds, Hamilton made the unusual decision to publish a detailed pamphlet admitting the extramarital relationship while denying misuse of Treasury resources. The disclosure protected him from charges of embezzlement, but inflicted damage on his reputation and his family. Elizabeth endured the humiliation with composure, though the episode tested their marriage. Social expectations in the late 18th century placed heavy emphasis on public virtue. Scandal carried consequences not only for individuals but for household standing. Hamilton returned to legal practice, perhaps seeking steadiness in professional routine amid political turbulence. As the election of 1800 approached, partisan divisions sharpened further. Federalists nominated Adams for a second term. Democratic Republicans put forward Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. The electoral system at the time did not distinguish between presidential and vice presidential votes, resulting in Jefferson and Burr receiving an equal number of electoral votes. The decision moved to the House of Representatives, where Federalists still held influence. Hamilton found himself in a complex position. He distrusted Jefferson's policies but regarded Burr as lacking principle. In letters to Federalist representatives, he argued that Jefferson, though an ideological opponent, possessed a consistent philosophy, whereas Burr appeared guided by personal advancement. His advocacy contributed to the eventual decision by several Federalists to support Jefferson, breaking the deadlock. Jefferson assumed the presidency in 1801, marking the first peaceful transfer of power between parties in American history. For Hamilton, the transition signaled both continuity and displacement. The constitutional framework he had helped design functioned as intended, yet his own influence within the federal government diminished significantly. The Federalist Party entered a period of decline. Regional divisions weakened its national appeal. Hamilton remained active in legal and political circles, but his ability to shape policy at the federal level decreased. He continued corresponding with allies, offering strategic advice and critiquing developments he considered risky to national stability. Economic life in the early 19th century showed signs of expansion. Trade continued despite European conflicts. Western territories attracted settlers seeking land and opportunity. Infrastructure remained limited, but rivers and coastal routes facilitated commerce. Urban centers like New York grew gradually, benefiting from harbor trade. Hamilton's early vision of commercial dynamism appeared partly realized, though under different political leadership. Within his family, the children were growing. Education, manners, and religious instruction were priorities. Hamilton valued disciplined study and expected similar diligence from his sons. He balanced affection with high standards. The domestic sphere offered moments of stability amid public contention. Tensions between Hamilton and Aaron Burr, however, deepened. Their rivalry had roots in earlier political contests within New York. Burr's pragmatic alliances contrasted with Hamilton's ideological commitments. In 1804, Burr ran for governor of New York after failing to secure renomination as Jefferson's vice president. Hamilton opposed him, reportedly expressing doubts about Burr's character in private correspondence that became public. The culture of honor in early American society treated reputation seriously. Public accusations could provoke formal challenges. Dueling, though increasingly criticized, remained a practice among certain circles to resolve disputes of honor. Hamilton had previously engaged in such encounters, sometimes deliberately aiming to avoid injury while demonstrating willingness to stand by words. As Burr's gubernatorial campaign faltered, resentment toward Hamilton intensified. Reports of Hamilton's critical remarks circulated. Burr demanded explanation. Exchanges between intermediaries failed to reconcile positions. The expectation of satisfaction through duel grew likely. In these years leading to 1804, Hamilton's life reflected accumulated complexity. He had shaped national finance, influenced constitutional ratification, and navigated party conflict. He had endured personal scandal and political marginalization. His convictions about energetic government remained intact, even as public sentiment shifted. The Republic itself continued evolving. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803, though executed under Jefferson, expanded national territory dramatically. Questions about constitutional authority surfaced again, illustrating that debates about federal power did not belong exclusively to one party. Hamilton observed developments from outside formal office, aware that institutions he had championed were being tested in new ways. His legal practice remained substantial. He argued cases before state and federal courts, often addressing commercial disputes that reflected expanding economic activity. His analytical style endured. Clients valued his ability to frame issues precisely and anticipate counter-arguments. As the summer of 1804 approached, the unresolved conflict with Burr cast a shadow over these routines. The codes of honor did not allow indefinite postponement once challenge was issued. Friends attempted mediation. Hamilton considered implications for family and public standing. The choice to participate in a duel was neither impulsive nor casual. It emerged from a social framework that linked personal integrity with public credibility. The broader society watched such affairs with mixed reaction. Some condemned dueling as relic of aristocratic violence. Others viewed it as regrettable, but sometimes unavoidable among gentlemen. Religious leaders increasingly criticized the practice. Yet the culture persisted, particularly among political figures whose reputations were central to influence. Hamilton prepared quietly. He arranged personal affairs and reflected on his responsibilities. The Caribbean boy who had once navigated storms now faced a different kind of reckoning, one shaped by human judgment rather than natural force. The morning of the 11th of July, 1804, on the heights of Weehawken, New Jersey, two men met with pistols. The setting was familiar ground for duels, chosen for relative privacy across the river from New York. The outcome would not only end a life, but reverberate through a young nation still defining its character. The early light over the Hudson River on the morning of the 11th of July, 1804, revealed little drama. The water moved steadily. The shoreline at Weehawken, New Jersey, had witnessed similar encounters before. It was selected precisely because it lay outside New York's stricter anti-dueling enforcement, while remaining accessible by boat. The ritual that unfolded there followed established forms. Seconds measured distance, pistols were prepared, positions were taken. Hamilton had spent the preceding days arranging his affairs with deliberation. He wrote letters expressing religious reflection and concern for his family. He indicated, in private communication, his intention not to aim at his opponent, though whether he would follow through in the moment remained uncertain. The culture of honor allowed room for gestures of restraint, but once shots were fired, consequences were immediate. Aaron Burr stood opposite him. The rivalry between the two men had developed over years of political competition and personal distrust. Burr's career had included military service during the Revolutionary War, legal practice, and political advancement to the vice presidency. Yet by 1804, his influence had waned. Hamilton's reported criticisms during Burr's gubernatorial campaign had intensified resentment. The signal was given. Shots were exchanged. Hamilton was struck in the abdomen. Burr's ball lodged near his spine. Accounts vary regarding the exact sequence, but the result was clear. Hamilton fell. He was transported back across the river to New York, to the home of a friend. Physicians attended him. Medical knowledge at the time could offer little beyond comfort and limited intervention. Internal injury of that nature was often fatal. He remained conscious for a period, able to speak with family and friends. Elizabeth was brought to his bedside. The scene was private, marked by grief and restrained conversation. By the following afternoon, the 12th of July, 1804, he had died. News travelled quickly through New York and beyond. Public reaction combined sorrow, anger, and reflection. Many condemned the practice of dueling more strongly than before. Clergy used sermons to question the compatibility of such violence with republican virtue. Political allies mourned the loss of a formidable advocate. Opponents acknowledged his abilities even as they had contested his policies. His funeral procession moved through crowded streets. Civic leaders and military officers participated. The ritual conveyed respect for service, though it could not resolve the divisions that had characterized his career. He was buried at Trinity Churchyard, near the center of the city whose institutions he had helped shape. Elizabeth faced immediate practical challenges. With 8 surviving children, she confronted financial uncertainty. Hamilton had not accumulated significant wealth despite years in high office. His legal practice had been substantial but not uninterrupted. Debts and obligations required settlement. Friends and supporters organized assistance, recognizing both his contributions and the family's vulnerability. In the years following his death, Elizabeth became a guardian of his legacy. She preserved correspondence and documents, understanding their importance for future interpretation. She also engaged in charitable work, notably helping to establish the first private orphanage in New York City. Her efforts reflected resilience and commitment to public good. Aaron Burr's position deteriorated rapidly after the duel. Though he completed his term as vice president, he faced indictment for murder in New York and New Jersey, though charges were eventually dropped or not pursued successfully. His political prospects diminished. Later ventures in the Western Territories led to accusations of conspiracy, culminating in a treason trial from which he was acquitted. His later life lacked the stability and recognition that had once seemed attainable. The nation Hamilton left behind continued its expansion and experimentation. The constitutional system functioned through peaceful transfer of power and ongoing legislative debate. The financial structures he established endured, though contested. The Bank of the United States would face renewed opposition and eventual expiration, only to be revived in altered form later. In assessing his career, contemporaries and later observers noted contradictions. He had advocated strong federal authority, yet defended constitutional limits when convenient to his interpretation. He had emphasized public virtue while committing private indiscretion. He had risen from obscurity to influence through intellect and discipline, yet his temperament sometimes intensified conflict, rather than eased it. The society in which he lived was itself full of tension. Slavery persisted, especially in southern states, though gradual emancipation laws began to take effect in parts of the North. Indigenous nations faced pressure from expanding settlement. Women's legal rights remained limited, though their roles in education and civic life gradually expanded. Economic growth brought opportunity alongside inequality. Hamilton's early experiences in the Caribbean had taught him that systems shape destinies. His response had been to design systems intended to stabilize credit, strengthen union, and encourage commerce. Whether those systems served all citizens equally was debated then and remains debated now. His life intersected with major transformations: colonial rebellion, constitutional design, partisan development, and early industrial planning. He did not witness the full unfolding of the republic he helped structure. Later generations would confront challenges he anticipated only partially: sectional conflict, industrialization on larger scale, and expansion across the continent. Yet even within his lifetime, the essential question he grappled with remained unsettled: how to balance liberty with authority. His answer favored energetic government constrained by constitutional form. Others offered different solutions. The ongoing debate became a defining feature of American political culture. Daily life for ordinary citizens in the early 19th century continued with familiar patterns. Farmers planted and harvested. Merchants balanced ledgers. Churches held services emphasizing moral discipline and communal responsibility. Children attended schools of varying quality. The Republic was not an abstract concept for them. It was expressed through taxes, laws, and local elections. Hamilton's children grew up in a world shaped partly by his efforts. Some entered public life, others pursued private professions. The memory of their father carried both pride and burden. His name evoked admiration in some circles and skepticism in others. Over time, historical interpretation of his legacy shifted. In periods emphasizing strong federal authority and financial modernization, his contributions were celebrated. In moments favoring decentralized power, his policies were criticized. His writings, particularly the Federalist essays, remained foundational texts in constitutional interpretation. The dueling ground at Weehawken eventually became a site of historical reflection. Visitors considered the cost of honor codes that conflated reputation with lethal resolution. The practice of dueling gradually declined as legal and cultural norms evolved. Hamilton's death contributed to that shift by illustrating its consequences starkly. In quieter moments, one might consider how a child born in uncertain circumstances on a small Caribbean island could influence the architecture of a nation. His trajectory was neither predetermined nor isolated from broader forces. It was shaped by economic structures, political upheaval, personal ambition, and social codes. He sought stability because he had known instability. He valued credit because he had witnessed insolvency. He defended union because he had seen fragmentation. Whether his methods were always prudent is open to examination. What remains evident is the consistency between his formative experiences and his later convictions. History cannot change the outcome at Weehawken. It cannot alter the policies he championed or the controversies he sparked. But our understanding of the conditions that shaped his choices can deepen. Perhaps the past asks not for simple praise or blame, but for patience in recognizing complexity. In the years when Alexander Hamilton's name appeared regularly in newspapers and pamphlets, when debates about finance and federal power filled meeting halls, much of the stability in his life rested on structures far less visible. The public sphere of the early republic was loud and often combative. The domestic sphere, by contrast, required steadiness, memory, and endurance. Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton and the women around her lived within expectations that did not place them at lecterns or in legislative chambers, yet their influence moved through quieter channels. Elizabeth had grown up in the household of Philip Schuyler, a general and landowner whose estate at Albany functioned as both family home and political crossroads. The Schuyler household received visitors ranging from military officers to foreign dignitaries. Hospitality was not merely social courtesy, it was part of political culture. Meals were occasions for alliance building. Letters were drafted at writing desks while servants moved discreetly through rooms carrying tea or clearing dishes. Elizabeth's upbringing prepared her to navigate conversation, manage logistics, and understand the rhythms of public life. Marriage to Hamilton brought both affection and complexity. His temperament was energetic, often impatient with delay. Her disposition was steadier. During his service in the Treasury Department, the Hamilton home in New York became a gathering place for Federalist allies. Dinners were structured, yet informal enough to encourage discussion. Elizabeth oversaw household management with careful attention to detail. Food procurement in the 1790s required planning. Markets offered meat, bread, imported sugar, and local produce, but availability fluctuated with seasons and trade conditions. Women in households like the Hamiltons also managed social perception. Clothing, comportment, and the tone of conversation communicated values. In a society attentive to honor and reputation, small gestures carried weight. Elizabeth's ability to maintain dignity during political criticism directed at her husband contributed to sustaining his credibility. She did not issue public rebuttals, but her presence at events and her engagement in charitable work reinforced an image of moral seriousness. Angelica Schuyler Church, Elizabeth's sister, provided a different kind of influence. Married to John Barker Church, a businessman with transatlantic connections, Angelica moved comfortably between American and European circles. Her letters reveal sharp intellect and observational skill. She corresponded with Hamilton in language that reflected both affection and political awareness. Through Angelica, Hamilton remained connected to broader networks of commerce and diplomacy, extending beyond immediate party lines. Women more generally participated in shaping the early republic through education and civic engagement. Though barred from voting or holding office, they influenced household decisions and nurtured political literacy in children. Schools for girls expanded modestly in urban centers, emphasizing reading, writing, and moral instruction. Religious congregations offered spaces where women organized charitable initiatives, distributing aid to the poor and supporting widows of veterans. The Hamilton household included enslaved individuals during earlier years, reflecting broader patterns in northern states before gradual emancipation laws took effect. Domestic labour underpinned comfort and productivity. The tension between ideals of liberty and realities of slavery remained unresolved in many households, including those aligned with Federalist politics. Over time, New York's gradual abolition process altered the structure of labour, but not immediately or uniformly. When the Reynolds scandal became public in 1797, Elizabeth's role shifted from hostess and partner to figure of public sympathy. The publication of her husband's confession brought humiliation. Social codes of the era placed heavy emphasis on female virtue and marital stability. Elizabeth withdrew temporarily from public gatherings, yet she did not abandon her marriage. Her decision to remain by Hamilton's side reflected personal conviction and awareness of family cohesion. The domestic environment also included children whose lives unfolded amid political turbulence. The Hamilton sons were educated in classical languages and mathematics. Tutors supplemented formal schooling. Elizabeth oversaw moral instruction, drawing on Protestant teachings that emphasized discipline and humility. Daughters received education in reading, writing, and domestic management, preparing them for roles expected in their own future households. Outside the Hamilton family, other women experienced the Republic differently. In frontier settlements, wives of farmers labored alongside husbands in clearing land and cultivating crops. They managed dairy production, textile spinning, and preservation of food for winter. Urban women in modest households took in laundry, sewed garments, or operated small shops. Widows of soldiers navigated pension systems that were often slow and inconsistent. Political polarization affected these women as well. Newspapers circulated through communities, sometimes read aloud in homes. Debates about the Constitution or foreign policy filtered into conversations at markets and church gatherings. While formal political participation remained closed, opinion formed nonetheless. Women influenced sons, husbands, and neighbours through discussion and moral framing. Elizabeth Hamilton gradually channeled her energy into organised philanthropy. In 1806, 2 years after Hamilton's death, she helped found the Orphan Asylum Society of New York. The institution aimed to provide shelter and education for children without parents, many of whom were affected by disease or economic hardship. The project reflected both personal experience. Her own children had nearly faced financial instability and broader urban need. The Orphan Asylum Society represented an emerging form of civic organization. Women led fundraising efforts, coordinated volunteer work, and supervised daily operations. Such initiatives contributed to the development of American civil society beyond formal government structures. In this sphere, women exercised authority grounded in moral responsibility rather than electoral mandate. Angelica's correspondence continued to preserve memory of Hamilton's character and thought. Letters exchanged among family members became historical documents. Preservation required deliberate care. Papers were sorted, stored, and eventually made available to biographers. Without this archival work, much of Hamilton's intellectual record might have been lost. The Schuyler family itself experienced shifting fortunes. Land holdings required management amid evolving economic conditions. Political alliances changed as new leaders emerged. Through these adjustments, women often maintained continuity of family identity, transmitting stories and values across generations. Religion also played a stabilizing role. Churches in New York and Albany provided not only worship but community support. Clergy addressed moral controversies, including dueling, temperance, and charity. After Hamilton's death, sermons reflected on the dangers of honor culture. Elizabeth's later involvement in church activities underscored her integration into networks that blended faith and civic duty. In broader society, expectations for women gradually evolved. The concept of Republican motherhood gained prominence, emphasizing the role of women in cultivating virtue among citizens. Education for girls expanded slowly, justified not by equality, but by necessity for informed household guidance. This ideology shaped the upbringing of Hamilton's daughters and their peers. Financial management within households required skill. Income from legal practice fluctuated. Investments in land or business ventures carried risk. Elizabeth monitored expenditures, and coordinated with trusted advisors to ensure solvency after her husband's death. Fundraising among Federalist allies helped offset immediate debt, but long-term stability required prudent oversight. Public memory of Hamilton was contested. Some newspapers praised his service, others revisited controversies. Elizabeth's stewardship of his legacy involved careful selection of correspondence shared with biographers. She sought to present a balanced image, emphasizing dedication to national stability. Her longevity, she lived until 1854, allowed her to witness decades of reinterpretation. Angelica's international perspective offered contrast. Having spent years abroad, she compared American political culture with European systems. Her observations enriched family understanding of global developments. Through letters, she connected domestic experience with wider events, reinforcing the sense that the young republic operated within an interconnected world. The household also reflected class distinctions. Servants and labourers supported daily routines. Their experiences differed markedly from those of the Hamilton family. Urban growth increased demand for domestic service, often filled by recent immigrants. These workers navigated economic vulnerability and limited mobility, yet their labour sustained the social environments where political discourse unfolded. By examining the women and domestic structures surrounding Hamilton, one sees how political life depended on networks beyond formal office. Hospitality enabled negotiation. Education shaped future citizens. Charitable institutions addressed needs government did not yet meet. Reputation management influenced public trust. Elizabeth's later years were marked by persistence. She visited former political allies, encouraged publication of her husband's writings, and maintained relationships with descendants of revolutionary figures. Her presence at commemorative events symbolized continuity between the founding generation and emerging 19th century America. The stories around Hamilton are therefore not only about cabinet meetings and constitutional arguments. They include evenings spent overseeing homework, letters exchanged across oceans, and careful balancing of accounts in household ledgers. They include the work of women who navigated expectations without public recognition, yet whose steadiness allowed political actors to operate. In a republic still defining its institutions, domestic resilience proved as essential as legislative design. While Hamilton's name became attached to fiscal systems and political theory, the quieter labour of Elizabeth and others preserved family stability and historical memory. Their influence reminds us that nation-building extends beyond formal structures into the daily work of sustaining households, education, and civic compassion. While the Hamilton household steadied itself after years of public strain, the wider republic moved forward under leaders whose visions diverged sharply from his own. The early United States was not shaped by one mind, however energetic. It was a field of competing convictions, ambitions, and temperaments. Around Hamilton stood figures whose influence equaled or surpassed his in different moments. To understand his world is to understand theirs as well. Thomas Jefferson approached politics from a distinct vantage point. A Virginian planter, educated in law and philosophy, he valued agrarian independence and local autonomy. His estate at Monticello functioned as both working plantation and intellectual retreat. Jefferson believed that widespread land ownership nurtured civic virtue. His suspicion of concentrated financial power contrasted directly with Hamilton's comfort in organized credit systems. Their debates over the national bank and federal authority were not merely personal disputes. They reflected contrasting social landscapes, commercial port cities versus rural plantations. Jefferson's presidency, beginning in 1801, represented a shift in tone. He sought to reduce national debt and scale back certain Federalist measures, including military expansion, yet he retained elements of Hamilton's financial framework when practical necessity demanded. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the nation's territory. Though Jefferson questioned whether the Constitution explicitly authorized such acquisition, he moved forward pragmatically. The episode illustrated how ideological positions sometimes yielded to opportunity. James Madison, initially allied with Hamilton during ratification debates, gradually aligned more closely with Jefferson. Madison's intellectual rigor shaped constitutional interpretation. His earlier collaboration with Hamilton on the Federalist Essays gave way to disagreement over policy direction. The shift underscored fluidity in early political alliances. Personal respect could coexist with strategic divergence. John Adams, who preceded Jefferson as president, embodied another strand of Republican thought. He valued order and strong executive authority, but maintained independence from Hamilton's influence. The tension between Adams and Hamilton during the Quasi-War revealed differences within the Federalist camp itself. Adams's decision to pursue diplomatic resolution with France, rather than full-scale war, disappointed Hamilton, yet it prevented escalation that might have further strained domestic unity. Aaron Burr, whose rivalry with Hamilton culminated in the duel, represented a more pragmatic style of politics. Burr's skill lay in organization and coalition building. He established political societies in New York to mobilize voters effectively. Unlike Jefferson or Hamilton, whose philosophies were articulated extensively in print, Burr operated with flexibility that some admired and others distrusted. His trajectory illustrates the emergence of professional political management in the New Republic. Beyond these prominent figures, numerous state leaders shaped regional priorities. Governors negotiated with federal authorities over militia deployment and taxation. Legislators debated infrastructure improvements such as roads and canals. In Pennsylvania, debates over Western land claims and frontier security influenced national conversations. In the South, plantation economies depended heavily on enslaved labor, embedding moral contradiction within Republican rhetoric. The press amplified differences. Newspapers aligned with Federalists or Democratic Republicans presented sharply contrasting narratives of events. Editors wielded influence comparable to office holders. Pamphlets circulated arguments that reached artisans and farmers. Literacy rates were rising, particularly in northern states, enabling broader participation in public discourse. Political culture increasingly revolved around persuasion through print rather than deference to elite consensus. Religious life intersected with politics as well. The Second Great Awakening began stirring in the early 19th century, emphasizing personal faith and moral reform. Revival meetings attracted diverse audiences. Ministers sometimes addressed political issues indirectly, framing debates about liberty and virtue in spiritual terms. Religious pluralism expanded as denominations multiplied. These movements shaped community values that influenced voting patterns and reform initiatives. Economic change continued to redefine social relationships. Coastal cities benefited from trade, while inland regions sought improved transportation. The construction of turnpikes and later canals promised to link markets more effectively. Entrepreneurs experimented with small-scale manufacturing. Artisans faced competition from emerging factories. The tension between commercial expansion and agrarian tradition persisted, mirroring earlier policy disagreements. Native American nations confronted mounting pressure as settlers moved westward. Federal treaties sought to regulate land cessions, but enforcement varied. Leaders such as Tecumseh would soon challenge encroachment, underscoring that the Republic's internal debates occurred alongside displacement of indigenous communities. These dynamics formed part of the larger environment within which Hamilton and his contemporaries operated. Slavery remained entrenched in the southern states and gradually diminished in the north. The Constitution's compromises on representation and the slave trade carried long-term implications. Political leaders navigated the subject cautiously, aware that overt confrontation could fracture union. The contradiction between proclaimed liberty and enslaved labor lingered unresolved. Foreign affairs demanded ongoing attention. Britain and France remained at war intermittently. American neutrality required constant negotiation. Trade restrictions imposed by European powers affected American merchants directly. Embargo policies later adopted under Jefferson sought to avoid entanglement, but inflicted economic hardship domestically. These measures demonstrated the difficulty of maintaining independence amid global conflict. The judiciary emerged as another arena of influence. Under Chief Justice John Marshall, appointed in 1801, the Supreme Court began asserting authority in constitutional interpretation. Decisions such as Marbury v. Madison established judicial review, reinforcing the system of checks and balances. Though Hamilton did not witness all subsequent rulings, his advocacy for strong federal structures aligned with judicial consolidation of national authority. State politics often diverged from national narratives. In New York, factions competed for influence over appointments and patronage. Political societies organized rallies and printed ballots. Voter participation expanded gradually among white male citizens, though property requirements still limited access in some regions. Political culture became more participatory, less confined to elite circles. Within this evolving landscape, Hamilton's absence after 1804 did not halt debates he had helped initiate. Supporters continued defending strong federal mechanisms. Critics persisted in warning against concentration of power. The Republic functioned through this tension rather than despite it. Ordinary citizens experienced these high-level disagreements through tangible consequences. Farmers assessed crop prices influenced by tariff policy. Merchants calculated profits affected by embargoes. Artisans weighed prospects for mechanized production. Families listened to traveling speakers who explained constitutional amendments or criticized legislation. Political identity began shaping social affiliations, even friendships. Education expanded incrementally. Academies and colleges trained young men in law, ministry, and commerce. Curricula included rhetoric and moral philosophy, preparing students to engage in civic life. Textbooks often reference recent revolutionary events, embedding founding narratives into instruction. Memory of the war remained fresh for many households. Women's roles, though still legally constrained, continued evolving. Charitable societies addressed poverty and disease. Literary circles encouraged reading and discussion. The idea that women contributed to moral guidance of the Republic gained acceptance, though without formal political rights. These developments provided context for Elizabeth Hamilton's philanthropic work. Regional differences deepened as population grew. New England towns emphasized communal governance through town meetings. Southern plantations operated within hierarchical structures tied to export agriculture. Western territories blended frontier independence with demand for federal protection. The balance between local autonomy and national cohesion required constant negotiation. The political leaders around Hamilton each responded to these conditions according to temperament and philosophy. Jefferson's emphasis on agrarian simplicity appealed to rural constituencies. Adams's insistence on stability resonated with those wary of radicalism. Madison's theoretical clarity shaped constitutional discourse. Burr's organizational skill demonstrated emerging campaign techniques. None acted in isolation. Their interactions produced policy outcomes that shaped everyday life. By tracing the stories around Hamilton, one sees a republic defined less by unanimity than by structured disagreement. Institutions provided framework for contest. Elections offered mechanism for change without violence, at least in most instances. The duel that ended Hamilton's life stood in contrast to this broader trend toward procedural resolution of conflict. As years passed, younger politicians inherited arguments from their predecessors. They referenced Hamilton and his rivals as symbols of particular approaches. The debates about federal power, economic policy, and foreign alignment continued in new forms. The Republic's capacity to adapt without collapsing owed something to the constitutional architecture forged amid earlier disputes. The individuals who stood beside or against Hamilton were not merely antagonists or allies. They were architects of alternative visions. Their presence ensured that no single philosophy dominated unchallenged. In that balance lay both frustration and durability. Long before Alexander Hamilton entered New York as a young student, the city itself had been shaping ambitions in quieter ways. Ports have their own character. They are neither entirely stable nor entirely chaotic. Ships arrive and depart, bringing goods, languages, rumors, and expectations. By the time Hamilton began his legal career there in the 1780s, New York was transforming from a colonial outpost into a commercial hub with national significance. The harbour was the city's pulse. Merchant vessels anchored in orderly rows when weather permitted. Cargo included sugar from the Caribbean, rum distilled locally, timber from northern forests, flour from inland farms, and textiles imported from Britain. Dock workers unloaded barrels and crates with practiced efficiency. Labour was physical and often seasonal. Free black labourers, enslaved individuals, recent immigrants, and native-born artisans worked side by side under supervision of merchants who calculated profit margins carefully. Hamilton understood this world instinctively. His Caribbean upbringing had trained him to see commerce as lifeblood. When he advocated for a strong financial system, he pictured places like these docks where credit agreements determined whether cargo moved, and where international confidence affected daily wages. The city's streets were narrow and uneven. Wooden houses stood close together. Markets operated in designated squares where butchers, bakers, and produce sellers displayed goods. Women bargained over prices. Children ran errands. News travelled through conversation as quickly as through print. Taverns served as meeting places not only for drink, but for political debate. Pamphlets were read aloud to patrons who might not have purchased copies themselves. Printing presses were critical actors in this environment. Newspapers aligned with different political perspectives competed for readership. Editors shaped public opinion by selecting which speeches to print and which rumours to amplify. Hamilton himself had relied on these presses to circulate Federalist essays. Printers, though not office holders, influenced the rhythm of civic life. Slavery was present in New York during Hamilton's early years there. Enslaved individuals laboured in households, workshops, and on docks. Gradual emancipation laws passed in 1799 began phasing out slavery, but the process extended over decades. Free black communities formed mutual aid societies and churches, navigating restricted rights while contributing to urban life. Their presence reminded observers that liberty proclaimed in revolutionary rhetoric did not apply uniformly. Immigration added complexity. Germans, Irish, Scots, and others arrived seeking opportunity. They brought varied religious affiliations: Lutheran, Catholic, Presbyterian, and established congregations reflecting homeland traditions. Churches functioned not only as spiritual centres, but as social anchors, offering assistance to newcomers, adjusting to unfamiliar economic patterns. Economic volatility remained common. A failed harvest inland affected flour exports. European wars disrupted trade routes. Insurance for ships was expensive and unpredictable. Merchants depended on reliable credit networks extending to London and the Caribbean. Hamilton's financial policies aimed to create domestic credit strong enough to reduce vulnerability to foreign markets. Beyond commerce, cultural life expanded gradually. Theatres staged performances drawn from British repertoire. Coffee houses hosted lectures on scientific and philosophical topics. Booksellers stocked volumes of Enlightenment thought alongside practical manuals. Education institutions like Columbia College, formerly King's College, trained young men in law and theology. Political gatherings were frequent. Federalists and Democratic Republicans organized meetings in rented halls. Speeches addressed tariffs, foreign policy, and the scope of federal authority. Ordinary artisans attended these events, forming opinions shaped by both ideology and economic interest. The emergence of organized political clubs signaled growing participatory culture. Infrastructure improvements reflected ambition. Proposals for improved roads connecting New York to inland markets circulated among business leaders. The idea of canals linking the Hudson River to the Great Lakes would later materialize in the Erie Canal, transforming trade patterns dramatically. Even in Hamilton's lifetime, the desire for internal improvement suggested recognition that commerce required physical pathways as well as financial systems. Public health challenges persisted. Outbreaks of yellow fever periodically disrupted urban routines. Quarantine regulations affected shipping schedules. Physicians struggled with limited understanding of disease transmission. Families often fled temporarily to rural areas during severe epidemics, leaving businesses shuttered. Such episodes underscored fragility beneath commercial prosperity. Artisans operated workshops producing furniture, clothing, and tools. Apprenticeships, structured skill transmission. Guild traditions weakened compared to European models, but informal networks maintained standards. Industrialization had not yet reached full scale. Production remained largely manual. Yet small manufactories hinted at future transformation, aligning with Hamilton's encouragement of domestic industry. Social hierarchy was visible but not fixed. Wealthy merchants constructed larger homes with imported furnishings. Modest families lived in cramped quarters. Yet upward mobility, though limited, was more attainable than in many European cities. Success in trade or law could elevate status within a generation. Hamilton's own rise from obscurity exemplified this possibility. Religious diversity shaped moral discourse. Anglican, Dutch, Reformed, Presbyterian, and other congregations coexisted. Sermons addressed civic virtue, temperance, and charity. Clergy sometimes cautioned against excessive speculation or moral laxity. Religious festivals and community gatherings provided structure amid economic uncertainty. The legal system formed another pillar of urban life. Courts handled disputes over contracts, property, and inheritance. Lawyers like Hamilton navigated complex cases reflecting commercial expansion. Litigation could determine whether a merchant retained solvency or descended into bankruptcy. Legal reasoning thus influenced not only abstract principles but tangible livelihoods. Entertainment and leisure existed alongside seriousness. Public gardens offered spaces for walking. Concerts featured European compositions. Seasonal celebrations marked national holidays such as Independence Day, though commemorations varied in tone depending on political alignment. Toasts and speeches accompanied such events, reinforcing narratives of national identity. Transportation within the city relied on foot traffic and horse-drawn vehicles. Street lighting was limited. Nighttime required caution. Watchmen patrolled neighborhoods to deter crime. Fire posed constant threat in densely built areas. Volunteer fire companies formed communal defense networks. The city's growth attracted speculation. Investors purchased land anticipating expansion. Neighborhoods shifted as wealthier residents moved northward seeking cleaner air and quieter streets. Property values fluctuated with economic cycles. Such dynamics provided opportunities for profit but also risk. Hamilton's policies resonated particularly in this environment. The establishment of the Bank of the United States and federal assumption of debt strengthened confidence among merchants. Critics accused him of favoring urban interests, yet the stability he sought extended beyond city limits. Still, it was in places like New York that his ideas found immediate expression. After his death, the city continued evolving. Commercial expansion accelerated. Immigration increased dramatically in subsequent decades. Infrastructure projects transformed trade routes. Yet the foundational patterns of debate, diversity, and economic ambition remained. To look at New York during Hamilton's era is to see a laboratory of Republican experiment. Urban life required negotiation among varied groups, merchants and laborers, immigrants and native-born, enslaved and free. Political ideology intersected with daily calculation of wages and prices. The harbour reflected both independence and dependence on global currents. Hamilton did not create this city, but he responded to it. Its restless energy matched his own. Its reliance on credit echoed his conviction about public finance. Its divisions mirrored national disagreements. In understanding the city that surrounded him, one understands the practical terrain upon which his ideas operated. The docks, the presses, the markets, and the courtrooms formed an ecosystem in which Republican governance had to function concretely. Abstract theory met barrels of sugar, contracts for shipment, and families budgeting weekly expenses. The Republic was not sustained by rhetoric alone. It depended on transactions recorded daily in ledgers. New York's story during these years thus offers perspective on Hamilton's ambitions. He envisioned a nation capable of harnessing commercial vitality without succumbing to instability. Whether his methods achieved balance remains subject to debate, but the city's continued growth suggests that financial structure played a role in enabling expansion. Around him moved thousands whose names seldom appear in historical texts. Their labor, consumption, and participation in public discussion gave substance to policies debated at higher levels. The early republic was built not only in conventions and cabinets, but along waterfronts and within workshops. When the Revolutionary War ended, soldiers dispersed across the states carrying more than muskets and worn uniforms. They carried expectations. Years of hardship had been justified by promises of honor, gratitude, compensation. Yet peace brought immediate practical questions. How would veterans support families? Would pensions be paid reliably? Would Western lands granted as reward be secure from dispute? Alexander Hamilton had witnessed the strain within the army during its final encampments. Officers worried that Congress lacked resources to fulfill obligations. The Newburgh Conspiracy of 1783, in which some officers contemplated pressuring Congress for payment, revealed how fragile loyalty could become when compensation lagged. Hamilton helped defuse that crisis, understanding that military dissatisfaction could undermine Republican legitimacy. After independence, many veterans returned to farms that had been neglected or damaged. Some found debts accumulated during absence. Others lacked land entirely. State governments attempted to distribute Western territories as bounties, but surveys were incomplete and claims often overlapped. Frontier settlement carried risk from both natural hardship and conflict, with Native American nations defending their own lands. Pension systems evolved slowly. Congress debated long-term commitments. Paying officers half pay for life proved controversial among citizens wary of aristocratic privilege. Hamilton supported honoring commitments as essential to national credit. He believed that failure to compensate soldiers would damage trust in government promises. Critics countered that fiscal prudence required caution. Ordinary soldiers faced additional challenges. Inflation during the war had eroded the value of wages paid in paper currency. Some veterans sold land warrants at discounted prices to speculators, unable to wait for distant settlement. Urban artisans who had served returned to workshops only to discover shifting markets. Apprenticeships disrupted by war needed re-establishment. In New England, economic distress combined with tax burdens sparked unrest, culminating in Shays' Rebellion in 1787. Many participants were veterans frustrated by foreclosure and limited political influence. The rebellion underscored how unresolved economic grievances could translate into organized resistance. Hamilton interpreted the episode as evidence that stronger central governance was necessary to prevent instability. The psychological adjustment from wartime discipline to civilian routine was also significant. Soldiers accustomed to structured command faced decentralized community life. The camaraderie of regiments gave way to dispersed households. Some veterans formed societies, such as the Society of the Cincinnati, to maintain bonds and advocate for mutual interests. Critics viewed these associations suspiciously, fearing hereditary elite formation. Widows of soldiers confronted particular vulnerability. Without consistent pensions, they relied on extended family or charitable relief. Churches and local governments provided limited assistance. The idea that the Republic owed sustained care to those who sacrificed for independence gained traction gradually, influenced by advocacy from leaders like Hamilton, who stressed credibility and obligation. As the federal government strengthened in the 1790s, veterans' issues remained present in legislative agendas. Assumption of state debts under Hamilton's financial plan included war-related obligations. By consolidating these debts at the national level, he sought to create uniformity and stability. Yet the practical experience of veterans varied widely by state and economic circumstance. Land policies shaped veteran experiences significantly. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 established framework for organizing territories north of the Ohio River. It promised orderly statehood and prohibited slavery in that region. Veterans who migrated west participated in establishing new communities, bringing with them memories of collective struggle. Frontier settlements required cooperation in building schools, churches, and defensive measures. Conflicts with Native American confederations in the Northwest Territory resulted in further military campaigns in the 1790s. Veterans of the Revolutionary War sometimes enlisted again, motivated by economic necessity or belief in expansion. Federal forces under generals like Anthony Wayne secured treaties opening land to settlement. These developments reflected ongoing tension between Republican ideals and expansionist ambition. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 included participants who had served in the war. Their protest against excise taxes was framed by some as defense of rights for which they had fought. Hamilton's decision to support federal enforcement illustrated divergence in interpretation of revolutionary legacy. For him, preserving order fulfilled the revolution's promise. For others, resisting centralized taxation embodied its spirit. By the early 19th century, as the founding generation aged, veterans became symbols of national origin. Public ceremonies honored surviving officers. Local commemorations marked anniversaries of key battles. Yet material conditions for many remained modest. The Republic had achieved independence, but economic equality was not guaranteed. Veterans' families transmitted stories of hardship and resilience to younger generations. These narratives shaped civic identity. School books recounted battles and sacrifices, sometimes simplifying complexity into heroic themes. The lived experiences of debt, uncertainty, and adaptation often received less attention. Hamilton's perspective on veteran welfare remained tied to his broader commitment to public credit. He argued that reliable fulfillment of obligations strengthened trust not only among former soldiers, but among international investors. A government that honored promises, he maintained, would command respect domestically and abroad. The War of 1812, occurring after Hamilton's death, would once again mobilize veterans and test federal capacity. Some Revolutionary War veterans lived to witness renewed conflict with Britain. Their participation in public discussion linked past and present challenges. In examining soldiers after the war, one sees how nation-building extended beyond constitutional drafting. It required integrating thousands of individuals back into civilian life while maintaining coherence. Veterans influenced politics not only through organized protest, but through voting and community leadership. Their expectations shaped policy debates about taxation, land distribution, and military structure. The social fabric of the early republic included these men and their families. Rural communities relied on their labor. Urban workshops benefited from their skills. Religious congregations included them among members. Their presence reminded neighbors of sacrifices that had secured independence. Hamilton's advocacy for strong national systems can be viewed partly as response to witnessing veteran hardship. He had observed how fragile compensation arrangements threatened morale. He had seen how inflation undermined trust. His solution emphasized structure, even if not all veterans agreed with his methods. The story of soldiers after war illustrates the tension between ideal and reality. Republican rhetoric celebrated citizen soldiers returning to plow and workshop. Economic conditions sometimes contradicted that image. The Republic's success depended on accommodating these disparities without fracturing. Veterans organizations occasionally petitioned Congress for additional relief. Debates over pension legislation recurred. Lawmakers balanced fiscal constraints against moral obligation. These discussions echoed earlier concerns about half pay and public debt. By placing veterans within the broader narrative, one recognizes that Hamilton's world was not confined to cabinet chambers or dueling grounds. It included men who marched barefoot through winter, who returned home to uncertain prospects, and who watched as political leaders debated the shape of the government they had fought to establish. Their stories complicate any simple account of founding triumph. They reveal the everyday labor required to translate independence into sustainable civic life. They also show how policies crafted in distant cities reverberated through farms and frontier cabins. As decades passed, monuments and memorials emerged, but the immediate post-war years were defined less by commemoration than by adjustment. The Republic's durability depended in part on whether those who had borne arms felt acknowledged and supported. Hamilton believed structured governance was the path to such durability. Others placed greater trust in local autonomy and community resilience. Veterans navigated between these visions, assessing which approach best secured their families' futures. The generation that followed inherited both the institutions built and the unresolved debates. The presence of veterans in town meetings and state legislatures ensured that memory of the war remained active in shaping policy. Their lived experiences provided a constant reminder that liberty carried material consequences. As the first decades of the 19th century unfolded, a new generation began stepping into public life. Children who had not known colonial rule, who had no memory of British troops in American streets, and who regarded the Constitution not as experiment, but as inheritance. Among them were Alexander Hamilton's own sons and daughters, growing up under the watchful care of their mother, and the sons and daughters of farmers, merchants, and labourers across the states. Education became a quiet instrument of continuity. In towns and cities, academies expanded their enrollment. Instruction emphasized reading, writing, arithmetic, and moral philosophy. Textbooks presented the revolution as a narrative of principled resistance and ultimate triumph. The complexity of political debate that followed independence was often simplified for young readers. Yet within families like the Hamiltons, conversation retained nuance. Letters preserved by Elizabeth offered insight into earlier disputes, allowing children to encounter history not merely as lesson, but as lived experience. Hamilton's eldest surviving son, Philip Hamilton, had already died in a duel in 1801, 3 years before his father's death. That loss marked the family deeply. The younger children grew up conscious of both their father's prominence and the fragility of reputation. They inherited expectations shaped by public service. Some pursued legal and military careers. Others entered commerce or private life. Their paths reflected the expanding opportunities of a nation still defining professional identity. Beyond prominent families, the children of artisans and farmers entered apprenticeships or inherited land. Western migration opened possibilities unavailable to earlier generations. Territories organized under the Northwest Ordinance admitted new states. Frontier towns established schools and courthouses. Civic identity extended gradually westward, though often at the expense of indigenous communities displaced by settlement. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 had set this expansion in motion. Exploration parties like the Lewis and Clark expedition mapped routes across vast territories. Young Americans followed trails into regions previously distant from Atlantic centers of power. The sense of national scope broadened. Economic patterns shifted as agriculture and trade extended inland. Political participation also expanded among white male citizens. Property requirements for voting were reduced or eliminated in several states. Campaigns grew more organized, with rallies, pamphlets, and newspapers mobilizing broader constituencies. The political culture that Hamilton had known, rooted in elite negotiation, gradually adapted to mass engagement. Economic transformation accelerated. The Embargo Act of 1807, enacted under Jefferson in response to European interference with American shipping, disrupted trade severely. Coastal merchants faced losses. Smuggling increased. The policy's unpopularity revealed limits of executive control over economic behavior. After repeal, trade resumed unevenly. The episode demonstrated how decisions at the highest levels affected ordinary livelihoods directly. The War of 1812 further shaped national identity. Younger officers and politicians emerged, including figures who would later lead the country. Battles on land and sea tested military preparedness. The burning of Washington in 1814 reminded citizens of vulnerability, yet eventual peace and symbolic victories, such as the defense of Fort McHenry and the Battle of New Orleans, fostered renewed patriotism. In this atmosphere, the legacy of the founding generation acquired ceremonial dimension. Surviving veterans attended commemorations. Newspapers revisited speeches and writings from earlier decades. Elizabeth Hamilton, aging yet active, witnessed these developments. She safeguarded correspondence that scholars and biographers sought. Through her, memory of debates about federal power and public credit persisted. The Second Bank of the United States, chartered in 1816 after the war, revealed financial disarray, echoed earlier controversies. Though Hamilton had been gone more than a decade, policymakers returned to mechanisms he had advocated. The recurrence of such institutions suggested that practical challenges often revived ideas once contested. Industrialization gained momentum in New England. Textile mills harnessed water power. Young women from rural areas worked in factories under structured schedules. Urban growth accelerated. Transportation improvements, particularly the Erie Canal completed in 1825, transformed New York into an even more dominant commercial center. These developments reflected trajectories Hamilton had anticipated when arguing for domestic manufacturing and infrastructure. Social reform movements expanded during this period. Abolitionist sentiment strengthened gradually in northern states. Temperance advocates organized campaigns. Educational reformers promoted standardized curricula. Women played significant roles in these initiatives, building on earlier charitable work exemplified by Elizabeth Hamilton's orphanage efforts. Political leadership passed to new figures such as James Monroe, whose presidency during the era of good feelings briefly reduced overt partisan conflict. Yet beneath surface harmony, debates about tariffs, internal improvements, and slavery continued. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 attempted to balance sectional interests by regulating the extension of slavery into new territories. The compromise illustrated enduring tension embedded in the Constitution's earlier arrangements. Hamilton's children navigated careers in this changing environment. Some served in diplomatic or military posts. Others pursued quieter professional paths. The family name carried weight, sometimes opening doors, sometimes inviting scrutiny. Elizabeth encouraged education and moral discipline, mindful of both opportunity and vulnerability. Public memory of Hamilton fluctuated. Federalist influence had waned, but his writings remained part of constitutional discourse. Lawyers cited Federalist essays in arguments. Political leaders invoked or critiqued his positions depending on context. His life became subject of biographies that shaped interpretation for successive generations. Ordinary young Americans encountered the Republic as established reality. They pledged allegiance in schools. They learned of Washington and Jefferson as figures of national narrative. For many, Hamilton's name appeared less frequently in popular accounts, overshadowed by presidents who followed. Yet financial systems he constructed influenced daily transactions quietly. Urban neighborhoods diversified as immigration increased from Ireland and Germany. Cultural pluralism expanded. Churches adapted to new congregations. Political parties learned to organize immigrant voters. The democratic impulse intensified, culminating in the rise of Andrew Jackson, whose presidency beginning in 1829 represented populist shift and renewed contestation over the national bank. Jackson's opposition to the bank echoed earlier criticisms leveled at Hamilton's financial architecture. The bank war of the 1830s resulted in the bank's eventual demise. Yet debates about centralized finance did not disappear. They resurfaced in subsequent decades under different institutional forms. The persistence of such debates demonstrated the durability of foundational questions. Elizabeth Hamilton lived long enough to witness these shifts. She saw the Republic expand territorially and economically. She observed new leaders reinterpret founding principles. Her continued efforts to publish and preserve her husband's writings ensured that his voice remained part of national conversation. For the broader generation born after independence, the revolutionary struggle receded into memory. Yet the structures it produced framed their opportunities. Public credit-enabled infrastructure. Constitutional mechanisms mediated disputes. Elections provided means for peaceful change, though not without tension. The children of veterans and statesmen inherited both advantages and burdens. They bore responsibility to maintain institutions crafted amid uncertainty. They also faced new challenges unforeseen by their predecessors: industrial labor conditions, sectional polarization, and waves of immigration that would reshape demographics profoundly. In tracing the next generation, one sees how founding ideas persist through adaptation rather than preservation in static form. Hamilton's advocacy for energetic government influenced later debates, even when specific policies were revised. His emphasis on credit and stability resonated during financial crises that recurred periodically. Families across the nation negotiated similar transitions. Parents who had known colonial rule guided children who identified solely as Americans. Stories told at hearths linked personal sacrifice to national purpose. Education, religion, and civic ritual transmitted values unevenly but persistently. The Republic matured through trial and adjustment. Economic cycles tested resilience. Political movements rose and fell. The Constitution, amended gradually, provided continuity while allowing modification. Hamilton's role within that architecture remained part of ongoing interpretation. As younger citizens assumed leadership, they evaluated the founding generation not as untouchable icons, but as human actors whose decisions carried mixed consequences. Some admired Hamilton's clarity and foresight. Others criticized his preference for centralized power. The debate itself became testament to the vitality of Republican discourse. The early 19th century thus reveals the unfolding of a story larger than any individual. Hamilton's children and their contemporaries lived within frameworks shaped before they could vote. They altered those frameworks in response to new realities. The process of inheritance and revision defined their era. As the generation that had known revolution gradually withdrew from public life, memory became an active force rather than a simple recollection. The early republic had been built by individuals who disagreed intensely, yet shared formative experience of imperial conflict. The decades that followed required citizens who had not stood in those camps or attended those conventions to interpret what the founding meant. In that reinterpretation, Alexander Hamilton's ideas entered a new phase, less immediate, more conceptual. The expansion of print culture played a central role in this transformation. Biographies of prominent leaders circulated widely. Early accounts of the revolution often emphasized unity and virtue, smoothing over rivalries that had once seemed sharp. Hamilton's life, shaped by both accomplishment and controversy, resisted easy simplification. Some writers portrayed him as visionary architect of financial stability. Others framed him as advocate of centralized power at odds with agrarian democracy. In the legal profession, however, his influence remained concrete. Courts continued referencing Federalist essays when considering constitutional interpretation. Lawyers trained in the early 19th century studied these writings not as partisan arguments but as analytical guides. The logic of federal authority, separation of powers, and the role of the judiciary retained practical significance as cases reached the Supreme Court. Chief Justice John Marshall's tenure from 1801 to 1835 strengthened federal judicial authority through landmark decisions. While Marshall's reasoning drew on multiple sources, it resonated with Hamilton's earlier insistence that national institutions required coherence and durability. The interplay between executive, legislative, and judicial branches matured in part through these interpretations. Economic change intensified. The market revolution accelerated exchange between regions. Canals, roads, and eventually railroads connected interior farms with coastal ports. Banks multiplied, extending credit to entrepreneurs. Financial panics, such as the Panic of 1819, exposed vulnerabilities within expanding systems. The debate over centralized versus decentralized banking revived arguments reminiscent of Hamilton's era. During such crises, observers reconsidered his emphasis on structured public credit. Some concluded that stable institutions could mitigate speculative excess. Others blamed centralized banks for amplifying volatility. The recurring cycle of innovation and correction suggested that financial architecture required continual adjustment. Politically, the collapse of the Federalist Party created space for new alignments. The Democratic-Republican Party itself fractured into factions. Andrew Jackson's rise introduced a style of leadership, emphasizing popular appeal and suspicion of entrenched elites. His opposition to the Second Bank of the United States drew direct lineage from earlier anti-Hamiltonian sentiment. The eventual dismantling of the bank signaled triumph of one vision over another. though not permanent resolution. At the same time, industrial development advanced in northern states. Textile mills in Massachusetts and manufacturing centers in Pennsylvania expanded output. Wage labor became more common. Urban populations grew, bringing new social challenges. Labor organizations formed to advocate for shorter workdays and improved conditions. The role of federal government in regulating economic life remained contested. Immigration surged in the 1840s, particularly from Ireland amid famine. New York's population expanded rapidly. Tenement housing crowded neighborhoods. Political machines emerged to organize immigrant votes. Civic identity evolved to incorporate diverse cultural backgrounds. The Republic's adaptability was tested by this demographic shift. Slavery, long embedded in Southern economies, increasingly polarized national debate. Abolitionist movements gained momentum in the North. Southern leaders defended slavery as economic necessity and social order. Compromises over new territories delayed confrontation, but did not eliminate underlying tension. The federal system designed in the 1780s faced strain from sectional divergence. In this environment, Hamilton's legacy intersected indirectly with debates over union and authority. Advocates for preserving federal cohesion cited principles of national supremacy embedded in constitutional design. Critics of centralized enforcement invoked states' rights. The arguments echoed earlier disputes, though now framed by different issues. Elizabeth Hamilton, living into her 90s, observed these changes from a vantage point that bridged eras. She engaged with younger historians and visitors who sought first-hand insight into the founding generation. Her recollections influenced how later Americans understood early struggles. Memory, filtered through personal experience, became part of national narrative. Education reforms during this period expanded literacy and standardized curricula. Students encountered condensed accounts of constitutional debates. The complexity of Hamilton's financial program might be summarized in a few paragraphs, yet its implications endured in banking practices and fiscal policy. Simplification risked obscuring nuance, but it also allowed broader dissemination of civic knowledge. Religious revivals, particularly during the Second Great Awakening, reshaped moral discourse. Reform movements addressing temperance, prison conditions, and women's rights drew on renewed emphasis on individual responsibility and communal improvement. These movements operated within constitutional structures established decades earlier. Their success or failure depended partly on the flexibility of those structures. Women's roles continued evolving. The Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 articulated demands for expanded rights. Though long after Hamilton's death, such developments reflected ongoing negotiation between inherited norms and emerging expectations. Elizabeth's earlier charitable work represented a precursor to broader civic engagement by women. As the 19th century progressed, historians began evaluating founding figures more critically. Romanticized portrayals yielded to analysis of political maneuvering and personal contradiction. Hamilton's affair and duel, once sources of scandal, became subjects of scholarly inquiry rather than mere gossip. His immigrant background attracted renewed interest in a nation increasingly shaped by newcomers. Economic integration deepened. Railroads linked distant markets. Telegraph lines transmitted information rapidly. Financial institutions evolved to manage growing complexity. The principles of credit and centralized fiscal coordination that Hamilton had advanced continued informing policy debates, even when adapted to new circumstances. By mid-century, sectional conflict intensified into crisis. The Civil War tested the constitutional framework profoundly. Abraham Lincoln's administration invoked federal authority to preserve union, echoing themes of national supremacy. While direct lines between Hamilton's writings and wartime policy are not simple, the intellectual groundwork for strong central government provided foundation for actions taken during emergency. After the war, Reconstruction and industrial expansion transformed society further. Banking systems were reorganized through national banking acts. Public debt incurred during conflict required management. In these contexts, Hamilton's early insistence on honouring obligations resonated with policymakers confronting similar dilemmas. Through these decades, his name remained present in scholarly discourse, though less dominant in popular imagination compared to figures like Washington or Lincoln. Yet financial districts in cities, including New York's Wall Street, reflected institutional legacies aligned with his vision. The intertwining of government and commerce, for better or worse, became characteristic of American development. Memory of the duel at Weehawken persisted as cautionary tale about honor culture. Over time, public condemnation of dueling solidified. Legal reforms and shifting social norms rendered such encounters obsolete. Hamilton's death became emblematic of transition from personal codes to institutional resolution of conflict. As the 19th century approached its end, interest in the founding generation revived during periods of national reflection. Centennial commemorations revisited constitutional debates. Biographies re-examined Hamilton's contributions in light of industrial and financial growth. His immigrant origins gained symbolic value in a society negotiating identity amid diversity. The Republic had grown beyond what any founder could fully anticipate, yet foundational arguments about balance of liberty and authority, commerce and agriculture, local and national power, continued shaping policy. Hamilton's life, once immediate and controversial, became part of a larger conversation about American direction. In observing the evolution of his legacy, one sees how ideas outlive personalities. They are contested, reinterpreted, and sometimes misunderstood, yet they persist when embedded in institutional practice. Hamilton's advocacy for energetic government did not settle debate. It ensured that debate would operate within a structured constitutional arena. The story of those who followed him illustrates continuity amid change. Children educated in the early republic became leaders in later crises. Conclude. Institutions designed in the 1780s adapted to challenges of expansion, industrialization, and conflict. The dialogue between competing visions of governance endured. Hamilton's name, inscribed on buildings and cited in court opinions, functioned less as partisan emblem and more as reference point for questions about national capacity. Whether praised or critiqued, his thought remained woven into the fabric of American governance. The House grows quiet now. The papers have been folded, the debates have softened into memory, and the river beside the city he once walked continues its steady movement toward the sea. The harbour that shaped his instincts still carries ships in and out, though none pause to consider the young clerk who once calculated cargo by candlelight. You have followed him from a small Caribbean island, through war, through argument, through triumph and mistake, through ambition and consequence. Around him moved wives and rivals, printers and soldiers, immigrants and labourers. The Republic did not rise because of one voice alone. It rose because many voices argued, resisted, built, and adjusted. Hamilton believed in structure because he had known disorder. He believed in credit because he had known loss. He believed that a nation, like a person, must keep its promises if it hopes to endure. Others believed freedom required greater distance from centralized power. The conversation between those positions never truly ended. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson of his life. A country is not settled once and for all. It is negotiated again and again, through courts, through elections, through public debate, through the steady work of families raising the next generation. As you rest tonight, you might picture that early Atlantic world, the docks, the ledgers, the narrow streets, and consider how much of our present still carries echoes of those beginnings.